NAFI would like to thank Sporties and AOPA for their generous sponsorship of this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast.
Welcome to the More Right Rudder podcast. I'm Beth Stanton, NAFI's Director of Publications and Editor. This is More to the Story, a series where we delve deeper into some recent articles published in Mentor magazine. Today, we welcome Larry Bothe. In the September-October DPE-themed edition of Mentor, Larry authored Musings from a Retired DPE, Things You Might Like to Know. Larry is a former DPE, Wright Brothers master pilot, and has 8,800 hours a year aloft in 100 types of aircraft. From 2012 to 2017, Larry wrote the What the Examiner Sees column in Mentor magazine. And he was also the 2015 recipient of NAFI's Greg J. Laszlo Excellence in Writing Award. Larry, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
I feel like we kind of have like mentor royalty with us. You're a former columnist. You're a Laszlo Award winner. You've contributed so much to Mentor over the years. Also feature articles, of course. And I know my predecessor, David Hipschman, you worked a lot with him over the years. So I really appreciate you stepping up to the plate and keeping up the contributions to our magazine, because people like you have such a depth and breadth of information, and sharing it with NAFI members is just amazing. So thank you so much.
Well, you're welcome. But Beth, I do this because I think it's a lot of fun. And I think more people should think about writing for you. They think it's hard or they'll be criticized, and none of those things happen. It's just a lot of fun to write stuff.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for that plug, because, as I make no secret, one of the reasons that I love doing this podcast is to, sort of nudge people and give them the inkling of like, oh, maybe I'll write for Mentor too. So thank you for that plug right off the bat, Larry. So this series is called More to the Story, and literally Larry's article that featured in Mentor, he originally submitted it to me and it was about 3,800 words, which was a little more than I could fit in the magazine. I ended up publishing 2,400-ish words. So he actually does have a more to this story. He called them war stories, but they're actually not war stories, but they're just very fascinating and informative tidbits of knowledge. Larry, how about you tell us a little bit about, but before we get started on that, you became a DPE at age 59. It was later in your aviation career, and you were a DP for 15 years, from 2002 to 2017. So you have a lot of stories and you've had a lot of experiences to share. And so my first question was, when I asked you to write this article, or if you'd be willing to, and you said yes, you had a lot to choose from. So I'm curious, like, how did you choose what you chose to write about? You wrote about a lot of very wide breadth of topics.
Ooh, I had never thought about that question, Beth. To start with, I wrote all these articles for Mentor for 5 years. You mentioned I wrote the What the Examiner Sees column. So some things I've already written about. But the truth is, as a pilot examiner, I did over 1,000 check rides. Most of them you don't remember. The applicant comes in, you do the check ride according to the way the FAA wants it done, the applicant passes, and you do the next one. However, there are a few that stand out in your memory because something odd happened or made it memorable. And those are the things that I wrote about, the ones that weren't quite according to the book, not that they weren't conducted in a proper fashion, but odd things happened along the way that don't normally happen. That's what I wrote about.
I love that. So when it comes to being a candidate for a pilot rating or certificate, you don't want to be memorable. You want to just be...
That's what I tell people. Come up to me at Oshkosh all the time, because I do live forums at Oshkosh, and people will come up to me and say hello, and you did my check ride in 2011, and I don't remember them mostly. They have to tell me. They act like I should remember their name. And they remember mine because getting your first pilot certificate's a big deal. But I don't remember them. They're just one of 1,000 faces in the past. So first thing I do is say, pardon me, would you tell me your name? I don't remember. And we go from there.
I love that. So one of the stories that I had to cut for space purposes in the magazine was you had a woman, you were doing an instrument check ride with her, and it was a very interesting outcome when you informed her that she was not going to be passing her check ride. So could you tell us a little bit about this story? Because I think it's really important for CFIs to kind of understand the mindset that some candidates can get into.
Okay, sure. Just let me do a little bit of lead-in so it makes sense to people. It's an instrument check ride, and during the oral portion, I asked the candidate how you would know that you had a good signal for navigation. What your instruments tell you that you're getting the right information, you can rely on it. And she couldn't give me the correct answer. And the correct answer is that you can hear the Morse code identifier for the station and that the instrument is not flagged. It doesn't say off. It says to or from. But it's a small question, and we don't fail people for missing one small thing. So I just let it go. The rest of the oral she did okay on. But then during the flight, I asked her to do an ILS approach into Columbus, Indiana. Standard, not a tricky approach at all. So she got vectored for it, and that was okay. But I was looking over at the instruments, and the glide slope was clearly flagged off. The localizer was okay. It was working. So she joins the localizer, comes into the outer marker approximately where you'd start down on ILS. And of course, the horizontal needle isn't moving. So I go, oh, this is going to be interesting. Wonder what she's going to do when she gets there. The answer is nothing. So she just flies along at the intermediate approach altitude is like 2,300 feet or something, and she crosses the marker beeps, and so she knows she's there, and she doesn't do anything. She just keeps flying along at that same altitude. Okay, well, another thing they tell DPEs is don't fail people instantly. First time you see they do something wrong. That's not fair. You know right away something's wrong, but you have to give less experienced people a chance to figure out their error. So I did that. I just didn't say anything. And we flew along and we flew along. So pretty soon, several minutes later, we got to the airport. Now keep in mind, it's all VFR. It's a nice day. So she gets right over the airport, and I said, hey, why don't you turn your head and look out your window there? So she turns her head, looks down, and says, oh, my goodness, there's the airport. And I said, yes, and I'm sorry to advise you that that's not satisfactory performance on an ILS, and I can't issue your instrument rating certificate today. And she goes ballistic on me and says that I can't fail her because she flew this very approach in that airplane the day before for practice, and everything worked perfectly, and it's not her fault it didn't work today. I said, tell the tower you want to land. So she does, and we land. We taxi to parking, and she tells me I absolutely can't fail her, yada, yada. I get up my cell phone, call up my POI, Principal Operating Inspector. All examiners have a boss at the FAA for oversight purposes. And I keyed up his number. I said, all you got to do is touch call. You tell him I can't fail you. Ooh, silence. And she just shakes her head. I said, okay, now, do you want to continue the check ride, or do you want to take me back down to Seymour where we started and just come back another day? So that was the end of that. So she failed. And she came back a week later and passed. Oh, but that's pretty weird when somebody comes to you and says, you can't fail me for some extraneous reason.
Well, so thank you for sharing that story with us. And I really wish I didn't have to cut it, but we get to talk about it now. But I have so many questions slash problems with this one. As pilot in command of an aircraft, we need to make sure that the instruments are working as they should be. We know that just because something worked yesterday, that it might not work today. And I
Right.
mean, I understand that probably the stress of the check ride and doing something wrong and become aware of that probably triggered this defensive response. But it's just shocking to me that like somebody would even go there in their mind that like you can't fail me because I did this yesterday. Okay. The other part that really freaking scared me, Larry, is what happens if a week later she was out flying with her family in actual IFR conditions and did that. There could I mean, that's really dangerous. So, I mean, the work that you do and the standards you have to uphold, I mean, they're there for a reason. I mean, all this aviation rules was written in blood is the saying. It just kind
Yeah.
of shocks me. I mean, you've seen it all over the years, so I'm sure it doesn't shock you, but obviously enough that you decided it was weird enough to write about.
Yeah, and here, just a further consideration. How long would it take? I gave her 4.5 minutes, right? I didn't fail her. I was hoping she might see it, fix the problem, whatever. By the time she got to the airport, it was over. But on that heading, at that place, in about 5 more nautical miles, she would have been in a restricted area, which happens to be a gunnery range.
That adds a little extra spice to the.
Now, we didn't know whether it was hot or not, but the point is,
Yeah.
that's what's over there.
Yeah.
How far would she have flown?
Yeah. Well, I mean, listen, every single pilot in the universe has made multiple boneheaded decisions and made those mistakes. I mean, it's a thing, it happens, and hopefully we learn from them and don't make them again and we survive them. But it just goes to show how important the work of CFIs is. I mean, again, by the time they get to the DPE, they should have all this stuff down, but again, we're human and people are going to make mistakes and equipment is going to malfunction. And so, always having that plan B, plan C, plan D, and being ahead of the aircraft and not be like realizing once you're over the airport that this is happening. So again, actually, I remember one time I had a couple of different primary flight instructors. And I remember one of my instructors who she had been teaching like 10,000 hours. I mean, I did something in the traffic pattern and she goes, I've never seen that one before. And some boneheaded thing I did. And I was like so proud of myself. I'm like, wow, I introduced a failure mode that somebody with 10,000 hours had never seen before. So the article she writes, she could put my thing in it. But so another story that we edited out for brevity purposes was actually, I found this story very fascinating. And this one had to do with when an examiner notices that a flight school is teaching something consistently incorrectly. What happens when that happens? So tell us a little bit about that story. It was the short field takeoff situation, I believe.
Yes. Okay. So you're exactly correct. Once in a while, flight schools don't teach things correctly. And what we're, as examiners, are encouraged to do is just simply go to the chief flight instructor and ask him to arrange with his instructors to have them teach it correctly so they do it right. And so I did that and asked if he would please tell his instructors to do that. Oh, yeah, I'll take care of it. They won't do it. So then another applicant makes the same mistake. And the mistake was not taxiing all the way back to get the full available runway to use for takeoff. They would arc onto the runway the way they normally do and leave 150 or 200 feet behind them and then take off from there. And what the instructors were doing, they're trying to save time. They're in a hurry. So they would say to the applicant, well, if it was really short, you'd have to taxi back to get the use of all the runway. And by the way, you'll need to do that for your check ride. But that's not what they were doing. And what people do is what they're accustomed to doing. So when they do it for me, they would forget all about that and they would just arc out onto the runway. And the first couple of times I was gracious and I made them taxi off the runway and asked them, what's the first element of a short field takeoff? The first element is use all the runway available. And then I would let them do it. And I passed them. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. But after it happened a couple times, I went to the chief. He said he'd fix it. Then another one did it. And I talked to my POI about it. And he unequivocally said, fail one. That'll cure it. So I went back to the chief flight instructor, third time, and said, Ron, the next one of your people that doesn't use all the runway for a short field takeoff, I'm going to fail them right there, and I'm going to be too angry to continue the test. And we're all going home. The next week I was back to doing, I did a lot of check rides at this one place. And the kid did that. And I said, I'm sorry, that's not satisfactory. Take me back to the ramp. What did I do wrong? You didn't use all the runway. Brats, I forgot. Yeah, you did forget. Not satisfactory. No one ever failed to taxi back after that. My POI was exactly right. All you have to do is fail one, and boy, the word gets out. So it works.
Well, this is as you're telling this story, I'm thinking of the law of primacy, right?
Exactly
right.
What it is. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's like, so when I flew aerobatics, you wear a parachute. That's part of what you
I've
have to
flown
do.
some aerobatics. I flew with Bill Kirshner.
Oh, how fun.
To learn aerobatics. Go ahead.
So you wear a parachute. Now it was the one that you sit on, like the parachute that goes under your butt was the one I had, not the one that's on my back.
Seat pack.
Yeah. So it's kind of to lumber out of the plane, like when you shut it down to get out of the plane with the parachute on, it's kind of a pain. So I would always unclip it and leave the parachute in the plane and climb out without the parachute because it was just easier to get in and out of the plane that way. And I did that for a long time. And somebody said to me, don't do that. Get out of the plane wearing the parachute. And I'm like, why? And he goes, because if you did have to punch out, there have been people in the past who, out of their primacy habit, undo the parachute and then jump. That's why we wear the parachute in case we have to jump. So people had actually undone their parachute before they got out because that was their habit. I get out of the plane, I undo the parachute.
Wow.
And I thought that was just insane. Like, why would you do that? But again, under pressure, under stress, you revert to that law of primacy. And so you weren't trying to just be a pain in the butt by telling these instructors use the whole freaking runway. Like, somebody might do that in the future and have a bad outcome because they didn't use the whole runway. Again, these rules exist for a reason, and it's up to you guys as DPEs to make sure they're adhered to. What do you think, Larry, of, again, over your 15 years of being a DPE and seeing all that you've seen, things have changed. I mean, you stopped doing check rides about 7, 8 years ago.
Yes.
You did them starting in 2002. A lot has changed over, I got my pilot license 15 years ago, and I used the PTS. That was the ACS hadn't come into existence yet. So over the years, from going from the PTS to the ACS, have you found that things have gotten more complicated? Are there more rules? Like, in your mind, has been in this industry for a really long time, how have you seen the training for both CFIs and DPEs and the standards that you're holding pilots to? Tell us a little bit about the shifts that you've seen over the years and decades.
Okay. So during my time as a DPE, starting, as you said, started working on 2001 and got it in 2002. Not a lot has changed. Yes, we've gone from the PTS to the ACS, but there's still a lot of books and information available to DPEs. Incidentally, there's a 306-page guidance document for DPEs also. So there's a lot of information. You have to go to school for a week out in Oklahoma City and so forth too. You can get appointed. But backing up, back in the 60s, their DPs didn't have to go to Oklahoma City. And furthermore, they didn't have to go through the Oklahoma City vetting process. They were appointed just by their local FSDO manager, and they, instead of a PTS or an ACS, which is a big document, there was, guess what? The Pilot Examiner's Pocket Guide. And here's one. This one's dated 1960. Is this little thing that fits in your shirt pocket. Last page is page 14. And that's the entire written guidance for pilot examiners in 1960. So a whole lot has changed. One of the and it's, by the way, mostly been for the good. The problem with the earlier system where local managers just appointed some senior instructor to be a pilot examiner is that they appointed their friends. And sometimes their friend wasn't all that well qualified. Now, Oklahoma City makes sure that people are qualified, and the FSDO managers have to go to Oklahoma City and say, who in my district has applied? And they send them 3 names. And they have to pick from them. They can't just pick their friend Sally or friend Joe. Doesn't happen anymore. Gets rid of the good old boy crap.
Well, in the same edition of Mentor that you had your article as DPE themed edition, Jen Watson wrote a very extensive article called En Route to DPE, and where she described the quite involved process, multi-year.
I read that article. It took years for Jen to become a DPE.
Yeah.
I thought it took me 11 months, and I thought that was a long time. And I go, well, I guess not.
Well, and, again, maybe 20 years ago, it was different, and things have changed. And of course, every individual's circumstance changes too, and where you're located in the country. Tell us a little bit about the process of becoming a DPE. So okay, your process was a lot shorter than Jen's, 11 months versus a decade. I'm just really surprised. Even your process, there's a lot of hurdles to jump and a lot of boxes to tick. They just don't let any chucklehead do this.
Okay, so real quick, so we don't get too far down in the weeds on this. First of all, I had applied in Chicago in the 90s, and turns out that I had not properly read the qualifications. And one of them is that you have to have 300 hours piloting command time in the year immediately preceding application. That's a lot of flight time in a year. And I had about 250. And so I got stalled in 2001. So I got stalled immediately and had to go fly about 60 hours. And fortunately, the guy I was working for at the time had a Champ and said, just put gas in my Champ and you can fly it all you want. So I'd be doing flight instruction, building time. And then when I got finished with that, I'd go get the Champ out and go fly around for a couple hours every day that the weather was decent. And so I got the 60 hours. I dropped a month off in the month, because it's 12 months immediately preceding. But fortunately, the month I lost on the back end only had 10 or 12 hours in it. So I got over 300 hours and applied. The committee in Oklahoma City that reviews your application, by the way, the application is 7 pages long with 5 pages of instructions. Now, it's online now, but when I did it, it was paper. And they only meet quarterly. Well, I had to wait for them to meet again. I just missed a meeting. So they met. Okay. And they said, okay, we approve your application. Okay, now I got to do the knowledge test. So I had to study a little for the knowledge test. It's the CFI knowledge test, except you have to get an 80. And it's all these esoteric questions they haven't used for 30 years. Right? Stuff you don't use in your everyday flying. Set of study guides, I pass. I got an 87. So that wasn't too bad. So then I have to apply to go to school in Oklahoma City for a week. The schools only held quarterly. So I applied to go to school. There was another school later in 2001. It was just before Thanksgiving. Oh, that one's all filled up. Sorry about your luck. And there's already a big waiting list. You'll have to wait till 2002. So now I wait. I say, oh, well, do they do it in like January? Oh, no, they don't do much in the winter. I think it's March. So I had to wait from like September to March to get a school slot. So that cost me like 5 months right there. So I went to school and passed, came back. You have to do a checkride, which is examine a real student with an FAA inspector sitting in the back seat watching you do it. And if you don't mess up, they'll appoint you to examine for private pilot to start with. And so that's what happened. I didn't mess it up badly, and I was accepted, and I started doing check rides in April of 2002. Just an interesting side note, by the way, in World War II history, most people knew about Rosie the Riveter, personified women who worked in factories and built all sorts of stuff. The first person I ever examined for the FAA was Rosie the Riveter's daughter,
Come
which was
on now.
pretty interesting.
Couldn't make that one
Daughter.
up.
Her name, Rose Monroe was her mother. Her name was Vicky, and I still know her. I keep up with her. She comes to Oshkosh, still flies.
That's so cool.
Now, I didn't get to meet her mom because her mom had passed away in 1997, and I did this check ride in April of 2002.
Wow. That's so cool. Well, one of the things that I learned from we're all learning from you guys. So between your article and your stories, in Jen's article and all the articles actually in this edition from all the authors is just how involved this process can be and really how dedicated the you guys are to serving the aviation community. I mean, this is like a marathon. This is a lot of work. There's a lot of things you have to do to get this process. It almost feels like a labor of love that there's just so much there and you care so much. So it was actually very touching to me to realize, because not everybody's cut out to go those distances when there's hurdles and there's roadblocks and there's delays, and you just keep showing up until you finally do it. And then once you start doing it, boy, there's some shenanigans that you spend,
A little hard to get started.
So it's just really impressive. As we start to wrap up here, Larry, I would like to get your take on what you think CFIs most need to do to have their candidates prepared for a successful check ride. Now, obviously, you could say read the freaking ACS, so it's not a secret. But as your stories showed, there's a lot to being a pilot than just following certain procedures and rules. I mean, there's so much judgment and there's so much decision making. So as a DPE, what do you see? How can CFIs best make sure that they can have their candidates to prepare for a successful check ride?
One thing that's a big help is if you can get maybe another retired DPE to do a mock check ride with them and to prepare them to being quizzed and tested by someone who's a complete stranger, because it's pretty stressful for the applicant. And if they go through it once, they can understand that better and not be as nervous and do a better job. One of the things that I try to stress is CFI should not use the threat of check ride to make their students study harder or practice more, because it goes like this. Boy, you better go out and practice those stalls more. If you make one little mistake in the airplane, you're dead meat. Or you better study those FARs more. There's a couple things you didn't know. You can't ask a question for the DPE. The test will be over. And it's absolutely not true. We are trained and emphasize that We are not supposed to fail people for trivial reasons, and we are not supposed to fail people for spaced out small infractions. The only way a person fails is if they consistently fail to meet the standards. Consistently means over and over again, 4, 5, 6 times. And usually DPEs will warn somebody once, you better keep an eye on your altitude. And we're not allowed to teach while we're doing a check ride. We can't coach. We can do it at the end in a debriefing, but not while the check ride's in process. But I had so many people during the years come to me that were just nervous wrecks because they had been told if they made one tiny mistake, they would fail. And everybody knows that they're not perfect. And so they know they're going to make mistakes, but if they make a mistake, they'll fail. So they're already in this death spiral when they walk in the door. And it's really bad.
I really appreciate you sharing how CFIs shouldn't try to frighten their students into proficiency, because there's enough pressure going into a check ride situation. Stress is, stakes are high, stress is high. So really, if a candidate is prepared and, the CFI's job is to prepare the candidate to have a successful check ride, hopefully they will feel confident enough for that successful outcome. Speaking of proficiency, NAFI has the Professional Development Program. This is a program that is a series of videos that folks can just go through this program, and it's a very excellent educational tool for CFIs. It's open to NAFI members. And I believe back in the day when the professional development program was first envisioned, John had you record one of the educational modules, I believe, Larry. Could you tell us a
Yes, I
little bit
did.
about the educational module that you created for the pilot for the professional development program? Do you remember?
Yeah, well, I had created a slideshow about that, and I did it live in the NAFI tent some years ago. I was on after John and Martha. Well, they're famous. Everybody wants to take pictures with them. And so they stayed. And you can't throw John and Martha out. I know them personally, but you got to just roll with it. So I go, oh, okay, well, I'll just eat into the break time between the next presentation and I'll be good. So I start doing my presentation. I'm about 2/3 finished, and whoever was in charge of it that day came and said, Larry, break, you got to finish this up and get out of here. I said, come on, I have like 20 minutes left. No, you don't understand. We're doing a panel discussion next. We got to break down the stage, bring up more chairs, bring stuff up. Okay. So I just spent another 2 or 3 minutes wrapping up, but it was that presentation. And after it, they said, that presentation sounded really good. We wish you would have finished it. And would you please record it for professional development? So that's how it came about, by me getting usurped by John and Martha King.
Well, thank you for sharing that story. And, I love hearing the sort of behind the scenes, how things get created. Whenever we pick up a magazine or we watch a webinar or listen to a podcast, it's all been produced and it's here it is. But there's all these little things that happened to get it to that point. And so it's kind of fun to hear the backstory about how this came to be. It's an iterative process. Things are unexpected. Yeah. So I'm sure when you put that presentation together, you didn't think, oh, it's going to become part of the professional development program, and yet
No,
here
it
we
wasn't
are.
intended that way at all, but it ended up
Yeah.
there.
Well, you have contributed in so many different ways to NAFI, and we thank you for that, Larry. Writing a column for 5 years is a pretty big freaking deal. It's a really big commitment. It's one thing to write an article and sort of, every now and again, which is also a pretty big deal. But to be on the hook for a column all those years is a huge commitment. Having done that myself, I understand that. So thank you for that. Thank you for continuing to contribute to Mentor and to NAFI. You're just a gem and a treasure. And I know you contribute to all of aviation and EAA and different, your local organizations to as Fast Team Rep. So just thank you so much. And that you just keep on keeping on. I love it, Larry. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'll look forward to seeing this when it gets released.
Yes.
Thank you, Beth.
Well, thank you, Larry. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for More to the Story. We will see you next time on NAFI's More Right Rudder podcast.